High Court saying that this vote has to take place. Speaker, or former now Speaker Edelstein, or soon-to-be former Speaker Edelstein, saying the High Court is overreaching its authority. So is there a right and wrong here in terms of, at least of terms of constitutional law?
Yeah, I think quite clearly there is. There is nothing in any basic law requiring this vote to take place. The Supreme Court decided to order a separate branch of the government, the Knesset, the head of the Knesset, to conduct an election and to conduct it on a vote, to conduct a vote and to conduct a vote on a particular day. This is the most severe and direct micromanagement of another branch, of the most democratic branch, by the court, and they did this not based on any law, but based purely on general principles. At the same time, this week, the opposition, blue and white, introduced a bill that would seek to basically prevent Benjamin Netanyahu retroactively from forming a government, from being the next prime minister. By doing that, they, in a sense, admitted that Israel has no constitution and that the Knesset can do whatever it wants. But then, when the Supreme Court, based on no constitution, says that the Speaker of the Knesset has to order a vote on a particular day, then they say, well, that's the rule of law, of course. You can't have it both ways. Either there's a constitution, which might embrace various general principles, like non-retroactivity, or there's no constitution, and the Knesset can do whatever it wants. But so far, we hear the opposition saying both whenever it's convenient for them.
Okay, I do want to clarify for our viewers that Israel, in fact, does not have a written constitution. It does have some basic laws. Danny, we heard Eugene give basically the government's position in this case, saying that Yuli Edelstein was not obligated to have that vote. The other side says that if he doesn't allow a vote, it's almost as if he is taking the law into his own hands.
You know, I'm not a legal expert, and I won't argue with my esteemed colleague in Jerusalem about the ins and outs of Israeli law. But, you know, I do find it bizarre when members of the Israeli government openly call upon the Speaker of the Knesset not to respect a ruling of the Supreme Court. There is nothing democratic or no respect of any kind of law and order if you have an Israeli government that openly calls upon one of the most high-ranking positions in Israel to defy a ruling by the Supreme Court. Why would any citizen in Israel respect any law if a government minister can say the highest court of the land, its rulings do not count? I think that is a very dangerous thing to do, even if maybe in the micromanagement issue that was mentioned here, there is a right and wrong. I don't know which is the right and wrong. But I think this is something that you cannot, as a government, take responsibility for.
Well, what about that, Eugene? We do have members of the Netanyahu government, including Naftali Bennett, other members of his party, which has been very critical of the Supreme Court, saying we are against the court exercising its power. But once it's ruled, unless the laws are changed, it has to be respected.
So no one really believes that. No one thinks that if the court ruled that, for example, Israel has to go and bomb some other country, or that the police have to execute political enemies, that you would have to do that. Right? You only have to respect the Supreme Court so far as their rulings are based in law. Otherwise,
no, I'm sorry, Eugene. Who gets to decide?
Totally unchecked.
Excuse me, Eugene. Who gets to decide that? So every citizen can decide himself.
In part of the separate. This is not every citizen. Part of the separation of powers is that there is a Knesset that is a check and a balance on the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court can tell the Speaker of the Knesset not just what is lawful and what is unlawful,
again, I'm sorry, but doesn't the majority get to decide in the Knesset? The majority, not the Speaker, is not a dictator. He has to serve at the will of the majority.
And he does not enjoy a majority in the Knesset anymore.
I'm sorry, I want to let Eugene answer.
Yeah, the majority controls when the vote is held. But when that vote is held is, in fact, up to the Speaker. No one doubts the vote will be held. They're just saying it's not fast enough for them. And the timing of actual votes, parliamentary procedure, the internal procedure of the Knesset, in the United States, I can tell you for sure, if the Supreme Court said to the Speaker of the House, you have to conduct a vote on a particular day or on a particular matter, you can't delay things parliamentarily, it would be a fundamental violation of the separation of powers. Israel, the Supreme Court, is doing this without the benefit of a written constitution to base this on.
But, Danny, I'd like you to respond.
It's a simple question. I mean, what kind of motivation would Yuli Edelstein have not to hold such a vote? Is it a legal one? Is it in defense of the sovereignty of the Knesset? Of course not. It is a purely political decision in order to protect himself and his prime minister, which might be a legitimate motivation, but is definitely should not stand against a majority in the Knesset, which clearly doesn't want him in this position anymore and wants to appoint somebody else.
All right, let's have Eugene respond to that.
The Supreme Court has absolutely no right to invalidate the Speaker's decision because they believe it's political. All politicians' decisions are political.
Again,
I'm not asking the Supreme Court, I'm asking you.
Right,
I'm asking you, in your opinion, what is the legal motivation of Yuli Edelstein to delay this decision?
I think it's quite clear that typically the control of the majority in the Knesset goes together with the formation of a government. And they're essentially, the blue and white is trying to use a sort of nominal, non-effective majority that doesn't really give them a government to control Knesset committees. And that is quite extraordinary, and there's no reason he needs to rush that. Part of the power of a speaker in any parliamentary system is the control of the agenda. So Nancy Pelosi in the U.S. House can, for political reasons, delay very basic votes and slow things down. No one doubts that. The Supreme Court can't tell her it's very important to pass a stimulus package, right? People might be dying. Vote yesterday, vote today. There would be a fundamental violation. And the question is, where does the Supreme Court get its power? Right? Can the Supreme Court do absolutely anything it wants? Is it supreme over the Knesset? So we should just have them pick the laws for us in the first place.
Danny, where do you want to respond to?
No. I think it's clear. I mean, there's no rational, understandable motivation for Yuli Edelstein to delay this vote other than just political pettiness. And I think that with the times that exist today...
That's true. Who says that's unconstitutional?
I'm not saying it's unconstitutional, but there is no constitution. Stop talking about... we're not in the United States. You keep comparing to the United States. There is no constitution. I think clearly... This country now needs a functioning Knesset as quickly as possible. We need a functioning Knesset, and putting unnecessary delays in the nomination, in the election of a new Speaker of the Knesset who will enjoy a real majority in the Knesset, that is simply irresponsible.
I want
the country also needs a government, and the speaker might well think that if a new speaker is elected and committees form now under the control of blue and white, it would actually delay the formation of a government.
I'm sorry, that is not for him to. That is not for him to decide. That is not for him to decide.
Gentlemen, I want to throw to both of you broaden it out more. Eugene, I wanted to broaden out also to you and Danny. What is a viable, this is the situation as it does stand. Where is a viable path out of this current deadlock in order to move forward into both form a government and perhaps reach some kind of compromise on either side while respecting the rule of law? I'll start with you.
Well, I think there's no clear path to forming a government at this point. I think that even if the issue in the Knesset is resolved, as I'm sure it will be within a few days after this petty little argument is resolved, there will be a Speaker of the Knesset, and he will not be Yuli Edelstein, and the Knesset will start functioning, and that is a very important component in facing the crisis that this country stands before. We need a budget, we need allocation of emergency funds, etc., etc. That does not to be clear, that does not bring us closer to forming a government. I think the political rift is as deep as it was at the beginning. There are a few options on the table. An emergency broad coalition, national unity government, a minority government. I think none of them actually at this point will stand a chance unless this side or that side or one or the other component of the political spectrum will compromise.
Right. Eugene, do you share that pessimism?
Well, first of all, I definitely agree that this is a petty little dispute. In 48 hours, less than 48 hours, Yuli Edelstein's resignation will be effective. The office will be vacant. They'll pick a new speaker. That speaker will convene committees. But I do think that the pettiness of this should make us reflect on why did the Supreme Court issue a ruling directly challenging sort of the prerogatives of the Knesset over something that's really just a matter of a couple of days. And
well, it wasn't at the beginning.
Gentlemen, I do think we've covered that ground. So I do want to go on and ask you yourself.
Okay, on the question of the formation of the government. Right. So I think Kahol V'Lavan, which got the first nod to try to form a government, I think it's quite clear that they've admitted defeat on that score. They're reportedly considering a bill that would delay government formation by 6 months, to extend the government formation process for 6 months and effectively lock in an interim government for 6 months. That's exactly what we need, 6 months of interim government, because they recognize they cannot form a government now, which I think was always clear. I think after their time runs up during Passover, it will be Netanyahu's chance. He's also failed to do this a couple of times before. I think the possibility of him closing the deal now is somewhat higher for a variety of reasons, including the coronavirus crisis. But I think also the prospects of September elections with the entire country paralyzed by this epidemic is completely unthinkable.
Right, Eugene. I just want to clarify. You say closing the deal. The prospects of Prime Minister Netanyahu closing the deal will be improved, perhaps when he gets the mandate. Closing the deal with whom? Who do you think he'll close the deal with?
I think he'll close the deal with members of Gantz's coalition, who I think are frustrated with his repudiation of his pledge not to take a minority government with outside support from the Joint Arab List, and whatever the merits of that, I think people are even more frustrated now. Some of his faction that during this crisis he would consider attempting to form a minority government, where obviously a broad government is needed to face this crisis.
Danny, that has been some speculation, at least on the side of those that support the government. They could sort of split blue and white. Do you see that likely, or do you see also possibility that Netanyahu himself may have to compromise on some of the things he's been unwilling to give on, for example, replacing the current justice minister or setting a firm deadline to step down that lock him in, which has been a concern, of course, from the blue and white?
You know, I can't resist saying that as a normal citizen, you'd think that in face of this mega crisis that the country, that the world is facing, these guys would find a way to compromise somehow and to get a government going. But quite honestly, I don't see your scenario working at this point. Maybe in a week, the tone will change. It's a question of political will. I think the small print is relatively easy to resolve. You give here, you get there, you demand this, you compromise on that. It's a political negotiation. It's been done a million times before. The question is there sufficient political will in very difficult circumstances, with a head of Likud who is under indictment, who is facing the courts, with a currently head of opposition who has a majority in the Knesset and who is theoretically not willing to work under Netanyahu, but also doesn't have a majority of his own. So, you know, as unlikely as this may seem, and maybe September, Eugene is right, is not realistic, we might be facing another round of election.
Eugene, what about on the side of the government? There have been conditions put forward to Prime Minister Netanyahu from the opposition that he has so far rejected. For example, relinquishing the Justice Ministry from the Likud, for example, or taking further steps, making Benny Gantz a sort of co-prime minister. This was an idea that was put forward by President Rivlin, which Netanyahu has also rejected. He prefers a rotation with himself going forward. Is it possible that if the circumstances are changed, the Speaker of the Knesset becomes a member of the opposition, the threat of this law that you mentioned that could prevent him from forming government, Netanyahu will start to look for some kind of compromise?
Yeah, I don't think the Prime Minister is likely to respond to the threat of the law that would bar him from forming the head of the party that received the most mandates from forming a government, because if they can pass a law like that, I mean, because that's not designed to broker a compromise. That is essentially the opposition trying to invalidate their main opponent and leave themselves as the last men standing. So if they can do that, they don't need Netanyahu's compromise, because they can just legally ban him from being prime minister, which is very scary, given that it's being done in the wake of the election in which he received the most mandates. If they had done that before the election, it would be unproblematic. You can set qualifications for prime minister, saying someone shouldn't be indicted to be prime minister, but you should do that before the election rather than after the election while the government is being formed. I think discussions about who gets what ministry is obviously completely legitimate, and everyone needs to compromise on that. I think in terms of rotation, given the crisis, other than Gantz's concerns about his future and his image, rotating now in the middle, that is to say, to create two prime ministers or some kind of strange structure like that, doesn't make sense. The way this has been done before is with rotation. Rotation makes sense, and it would also preserve government continuity in perhaps the most difficult time Israel has recently experienced.
I want to go to that question of passing this law, which Eugene said would be illegitimate, but technically it may be possible for the current current parliament, which has a majority of representatives that do oppose Prime Minister Netanyahu, to pass a law that says a prime minister under indictment cannot form a government. Would that be a legitimate step forward for the opposition to take, or in this case, the majority in the parliament?
Look, it's a legitimate thing to pass a law if you have a majority in it. I think nobody disputes that. Will it be legitimate to do it retroactively? I'm not sure that that is the plan. I think that there's maybe a higher chance to do it for the next election, but I'm not sure this is the most urgent thing on the agenda, even of Blue and White. I think it's the sort of thing that you dangle in front of your opponent just as a threat. I'm not sure they're actually going to go through with it.
As a threat, that Eugene Concepts, please.
But the bill has been introduced, and it does apply to the last election.
That's right. Yes. Again, potentially as a threat, but a threat that you believe, Eugene, will not be effective. Gentlemen, I want to just look at a statement made by President